average power bills have risen 15 to 20% in the past year, even as renewables expand.
Australia is committing the worst case of energy suicide. This might sound hyperbolic, but I'm not trying to be hyperbolic, I mean serious. Energy now is the number one existential threat, I think, to Australia.
I mean, truly, what is wrong with you Australians? You have natural resources that are the envy of the rest of the world. You're the Saudi Arabia of the Southern Hemisphere. You export 7 times more coal than you consume, and yet you don't want to burn coal. You have nearly 30% of the world's uranium, and you won't build nuclear reactors.
Even if you accept the science and want to insure against climate risks, the pathway to cutting emissions appears to be both messy and costly. Australia's share of global emissions is small, about 1.3%, because we're a small population nation. Yet we also export coal and gas on a vast scale, and those are far more sizable emissions that aren't counted in our national ledger, even though they dwarf what we produce at home. This is part of the disconnect the public can perhaps sense. Higher domestic bills to cut domestic emissions, which don't amount to a hill of beans internationally, while the coal ships keep delivering pollutants abroad, helping to keep energy prices lower in other countries. When did we first start striving for formal emissions targets? Australia signed the UN Climate Convention in the early 1990s, but the first quantified constraint arrived with the Kyoto Protocol. Kevin Rudd ratified Kyoto in December 2007, committing Australia to cap average emissions at 108% of 1990 levels. It was a relatively soft commitment by developed world standards, but it was our first binding commitment. Australia subsequently reported that it met the Kyoto commitments, and the Clean Energy Regulator confirmed we also met the second Kyoto target for 2020. The 2020 pledge was to be 5% below 2000 levels. The whole debate changed with the Paris Agreement, which saw significant increases in targets, and that put upward pressure on energy prices. The original Paris emissions target was for a 26 to 28% cut on 2005 levels by 2030. In 2022, it was upgraded and legislated to 43% below 2005 levels. And in September this year, Labor set a new 2035 target of 62 to 70% cuts to emissions. These higher targets matter politically because they translate into new expectations across every sector, from decarbonising electricity faster to forcing big industrial polluters covered by the government's safeguard mechanism to cut emissions by about 5% a year through to 2030, and accelerating the electrification of transport and buildings at a pace voters will notice in their wallets and their neighbourhoods. For most households, the impact of Australia's ambition on climate will be felt in one simple area: cost of living. The Australian Energy Regulator estimates average power bills have risen 15 to 20% in the past year, even as renewables expand. So how close are we really to achieving either the 2030 or the 2035 target? This year's inventory reveals that emissions are trending down, but the heavy lifting is still ahead of us. If Australia is to achieve the targets set, including the longer-term net zero target for 2050, economic pain is likely, unless there are technological leaps to help make it happen that we simply can't predict. On the government's own projections from last year, we were on track for a 42% cut by 2030 and a 51% cut by 2035. In other words, the newly announced 62 to 70% target for 2035 demands new policies to discourage emissions and penalise their use. What is Labor's plan to close the gap? It has 3 parts. First, make changes to the electricity grid. It is aiming for an 82% renewable share by 2030. backed by a capacity investment scheme that underwrites new wind, solar and firming. The latest tender round awarded contracts using big battery capacity, but analysts warn the 82% goal is at risk due to transmission delays and connection bottlenecks. Australia also has a ban on nuclear power, despite being home to around a third of the world's uranium reserves. A stark contrast to countries like the UK and Canada, which are investing heavily in new generation reactors as part of their net zero strategies. The ban narrows Australia's options for firming electricity supply.
You export 7 times more coal than you consume, and yet you don't want to burn coal. You have nearly 30% of the world's uranium, and you won't build nuclear reactors. You export 3 times more natural gas in the form of LNG than you consume, and you won't drill for gas. I mean, I just don't get it. I love Australia. I think it's an amazing country, but your policy is just baffling.
Treasury forecasts suggest that prices will ease towards the end of this decade. But for now, the price of things like firming, storage and transmission are all being felt long before any of the benefits arise.
Secondly, Labor is pushing industry to cut their emissions intensity, crediting those who get there quickly and penalising those that don't. They are targeting 200 so-called big polluters under reformed safeguard mechanisms. Critics worry that doing so will push up consumer costs and lower business productivity, thereby damaging the economy.
Energy now is the number one existential threat, I think, to Australia. And I fear literally for the future of the country if we can't keep going down this road. I mean, I fear for it for a whole bunch of reasons, but I think energy now is probably front and centre. And to get to 82% renewable energy target, we've got to basically shut down our baseload power. So our reliable baseload coal generators that have been running for generations on end, which have historically provided us with stable, reliable and very cheap energy.
Thirdly, the government is underwriting new projects to encourage private investment. It hopes that by taking downside risks, private money will flow in, advancing investments and new technology. Doing so is expensive upfront, and the build-out shows up in network charges and taxes before it ever starts to show up in lower wholesale prices. A global analysis suggests that decarbonisation spending must roughly triple to reach the net zero by 2050 goal. The politics of price spikes are immediate and obvious, whereas the potential benefits of electrification and cheap renewable energy accrue over a much longer time frame, and they're uneven across regions, which perhaps tells us something about the differences of opinion and perspective we're seeing on this issue within Labor, with the regionally based Nationals, and amongst Liberals where there are clear divisions.
So, is net zero by 2050 even possible? It is possible, it's just not probable. And whether we get there or not, today's politicians just won't be around to be judged on their successes or their failures, on whether or not it was right to bet the house on trying to get there, or saying no to the whole net zero target with the negative impacts that could have.
On the positive side of the ledger, the emissions intensity of the economy keeps declining. Coal generation is structurally in retreat, and clean tech costs continue to decline as well. On the negative side, however, there are serious system risks. The grid is shaky, firming to scale isn't happening, and supply chains are problematic. Also, technology assumptions are always a risk. Meanwhile, most modern wind turbines are designed to last around 20 years, far shorter than many of Australia's coal plants, some of which have been operating for more than half a century. If we lag behind the 82% renewable goal this decade, the 2035 step up to 62 to 70% emissions cuts below 2005 levels becomes a cliff rather than a ramp. Impossible to achieve despite all the economic pain that comes from trying. But maybe trying is good enough, even if the goals get stretched further out into the future. That's the view of many people who believe in climate change and worry about its effects. It's especially the view amongst younger voters. But there are also plenty of people who think that the targets are mythical and we should be focusing on adaptation to climate change rather than trying to reverse it. Labor treats the targets like non-negotiables and has locked its ambitious 2035 targets in exactly in that spirit. Critics call it zealotry when the numbers are aspirational and the costs are biting down hard on everyday Australians. On the other side of the political spectrum, the coalition is moving in the opposite direction. The Nationals have now formally dumped net zero by 2050 and want to peg their ambitions to the OECD average. Meanwhile, Liberals are openly debating whether to follow in their junior coalition partners' footsteps, and they look likely to. The ongoing climate change wars increases the risk profile for any private sector investments. Labor says that's the coalition's fault for being sceptical about the net zero target. The coalition says scepticism is the only realistic emotion, unless you treat net zero as zealotry. If targets are scrapped or made deliberately vague, capital goes elsewhere. If targets are pursued without a credible delivery and price impact plan, public consent frays. Either path can fail, which suggests that both major parties share the blame. The logical middle ground is to be honest about what targets are and what they are not. Australia's contribution is small in a planetary sense, but not irrelevant, especially given our export footprint.
It also means acknowledging that net zero by 2050 is a stretch. It's okay to call it aspirational, but the realisation of the pain and the difficulties of getting there need to also be realised.